He built an empire on positivity, on discipline, on being the hardest worker in every room he entered. For 3 decades, Dwayne, "The Rock" Johnson had been the man who smiled through everything, who turned setbacks into comebacks, who made success look like a choice anyone could make if they just worked hard enough. But what happens when someone decides that all of it is a lie? What happens when the most positive man in Hollywood is pushed to a place where positivity isn't enough anymore? On this particular morning at The View, Joy Behar was about to find out. She came armed with questions designed to crack the foundation of everything Dwayne Johnson had built. She didn't expect the foundation to crack back. Subscribe now and drop a comment below, because what you're about to witness will change everything you think you know about The Rock. The View studio felt smaller somehow when Dwayne Johnson walked onto the set. It wasn't just his physical presence, though at 6'5" and over 250 pounds of muscle, he dominated any space he entered. It was something else, an energy, a gravitational pull that made cameras, hosts, and audience members all orient toward him like planets around a sun. At 53 years old, Dwayne Johnson had achieved something that shouldn't have been possible. He had gone from professional wrestler to the highest-paid actor in Hollywood. He had built business empires in tequila, energy drinks, and athletic wear. He had over 300 million followers on social media. He was, by almost any measure, the most successful entertainer of his generation, a man who had defied every limitation ever placed on him. Today, that optimism was about to be tested in ways he never expected. "Dwayne Johnson, welcome to The View," Whoopi Goldberg announced as the applause finally died down. "It's always a pleasure to have you here." "Thank you, Whoopi. Thank you, ladies. Thank you to everyone here." He gestured to the audience with that trademark grin, the one that had sold billions of dollars in movie tickets. "I love this show. I really do. You always keep it real, and I respect that." "Speaking of keeping it real," Joy Behar interjected, and there was something in her tone that made the other hosts exchange quick glances. "Let's talk about your brand, Dwayne, because you've built this entire empire on positivity and hard work and all these motivational messages. But some people have started to wonder if any of it is genuine, or if it's all just very sophisticated marketing." The question landed in the studio like a stone dropped into still water. Dwayne's smile remained in place, but something shifted behind his eyes. "That's an interesting way to start a conversation," he said, his voice maintaining its warmth, but with a new undertone. "What makes you think it's not genuine?" "Well, let's be honest. Nobody is that positive all the time. Nobody wakes up at 4 in the morning every single day with a smile on their face. The whole hardest worker in the room thing, the inspirational posts, the constant motivation, it feels like a performance, a very successful performance, but a performance nonetheless." Dwayne leaned back slightly, studying Joy with an expression that regular viewers of The View had never seen from him before. "So you're saying that because I choose to be positive, it must be fake? That's the logic?" "I'm saying that authenticity has become a brand in itself, and you've mastered it. You've turned being real into a billion-dollar business. That's impressive, but let's not pretend it's the same as actually being real." Sarah Haynes shifted uncomfortably in her seat. This was not the light-hearted interview about movies and workout routines that had been planned. "Joy, I think what Dwayne has accomplished is genuinely inspirational to a lot of people," Sarah offered, trying to soften the confrontational tone. "Of course it is," Joy replied, not taking her eyes off Dwayne. "That's exactly my point. Inspiration is profitable. Motivation sells. I'm just asking whether there's anything underneath it besides good marketing." Dwayne was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had lost some of its usual performative energy. "You want to know what's underneath it? Okay, let me tell you what's underneath it." He shifted forward in his chair, and suddenly the studio felt even smaller. "In 1995, I was living in an efficiency apartment with my girlfriend at the time. I had just been cut from the Calgary Stampeders. My dream of playing professional football was over. I had $7 in my pocket. $7. And I sat in that apartment and I cried. Not because I was sad, because I had no idea what I was going to do with my life." His voice was different now, rawer, less polished. "I fell into a depression, real depression, the kind where you don't want to get out of bed, the kind where you start thinking maybe the world would be better off without you in it. I was 23 years old, and I felt like my life was already over." The studio was completely silent. This wasn't the Dwayne Johnson they were used to seeing. This was something else entirely. So when you ask me if my positivity is fake, if my motivation is just marketing, I want you to understand something. I built that positivity, brick by brick, day by day, because the alternative was letting the darkness win. I choose to be positive because I know what it feels like to have no hope at all, and I never want to go back there. Joy seemed momentarily taken aback, but she recovered. That's a powerful story, and I'm sure it resonates with people. But that was 30 years ago. You've been successful for a long time now. At some point, doesn't the underdog narrative become outdated? Outdated? Dwayne's eyebrow raised. You think struggle has an expiration date. You think because I've achieved success, I'm not allowed to remember where I came from. I'm saying that you've been wealthy and famous for decades. The $7 in my pocket story is touching, but it's also been monetized into merchandise, motivational speeches, and social media content. At what point does sharing your pain become exploiting it? The accusation hung in the air. Dwayne's jaw tightened visibly. Let me ask you something, Joy. Have you ever been so broke that you had to choose between eating and putting gas in your car? Have you ever been so lost that you considered ending your own life? Have you ever had to rebuild yourself from nothing while everyone around you said you'd never amount to anything? Joy opened her mouth to respond, but Dwayne continued, because I have. And if sharing that story helps even one person who's going through something similar, then I don't care if you think it's monetized. I don't care if you think it's outdated. That story is mine. It's real. And I'll keep telling it as long as there are people who need to hear it. But you understand why some people might be skeptical, right? Joy pressed on. You're literally the highest paid actor in the world. You own multiple businesses. You live in mansions. The gap between the person telling the underdog story and the person living the reality is pretty significant. So, success disqualifies me from having a past. Having money means my struggles weren't real? That's what you're saying? I'm saying that perspective matters, and your perspective has changed significantly since you had $7 in your pocket. Dwayne stood up slowly, and the movement seemed to shift the entire energy of the room. Even sitting, the hosts had to look up at him. Standing, he was almost intimidating. Let me tell you about perspective, Joy. My father was a professional wrestler, Rocky Johnson, one of the first black champions in WWE history. And do you know what he taught me about success? He paused, his voice dropping. Nothing, because he wasn't there. He was on the road. He was chasing his own dreams. And when he was home, he was hard, cold, critical. I spent my entire childhood trying to earn his approval, and never quite getting there. The studio was absolutely silent now. He died in 2020, heart attack. And you know what I felt? Relief. And then guilt for feeling relief. And then grief that hit me like a truck because I realized I would never get the relationship with him that I always wanted. That's my perspective, Joy. That's what's underneath all the positivity and the motivation and the brand you seem so determined to deconstruct. He paused, his voice thick with emotion. You want to know something else about perspective? I come from a Samoan wrestling family. My grandfather, High Chief Peter Maivia, was a legend. My father was a legend. That legacy was supposed to be my birthright. But when I started wrestling, I got booed out of arenas. People threw things at me. They chanted, "Rocky sucks," while I was trying to perform. Because I wasn't my father. I wasn't my grandfather. I was just some football player who couldn't make it in the NFL trying to ride their coattails. His voice hardened. I had to earn every single thing I got in that ring. I had to reinvent myself, create the Rock, become something nobody had ever seen before. And I did it while carrying the weight of a legacy I never asked for, and a father who thought I'd never live up to it. Whoopi tried to intervene. Dwayne, I think we all appreciate you sharing something so personal. No, Whoopi. She wanted to know what's real, so I'm showing her what's real. He turned back to Joy, his voice controlled, but carrying an edge that made everyone in the studio lean back slightly. You sit there and question whether my positivity is genuine, whether my work ethic is a performance, whether my motivational messages are just marketing, and you do it with this smug certainty, like you figured out some secret that everyone else is too naive to see. He took a step closer to the panel, but what you don't understand is that the positivity isn't despite the pain, it's because of it. Every time I post something encouraging, every time I tell someone to keep going, every time I share my story, I'm talking to the version of myself who was sitting in that apartment with $7 and no hope. I'm telling him that it gets better, that the darkness doesn't win, that there's another side to the tunnel. Joy tried to regain control of the conversation. I'm not trying to diminish your experiences, Dwayne. I'm just pointing out that there's a difference between genuine vulnerability and strategic vulnerability. And in today's influencer culture, it can be hard to tell the difference. Strategic vulnerability? Dwayne's laugh was sharp and bitter. You think I strategically decided to talk about depression and suicidal thoughts because it would be good for my brand? You think that's the kind of content that sells tequila and energy drinks? I think everything becomes content when you have 300 million followers. Even pain. Especially pain. And I think you've become so cynical that you can't recognize sincerity when it's standing right in front of you. The exchange had become something more than an interview. It had become a confrontation between two completely different worldviews, between someone who believed in the possibility of genuine transformation and someone who saw performance in everything. Let me tell you something about my followers, Dwayne said, his voice getting stronger. Every day, I get messages from people who were about to give up, who were sitting in their own versions of that apartment with $7, who heard something I said or read something I posted and decided to keep going for one more day. He pointed at Joy, and there was fire in his eyes now. Those people don't care if you think my positivity is a brand. They don't care if you think my story is monetized. They care that someone who's been where they are made it to the other side and came back to tell them it's possible. That's worth more than any amount of cynicism you can throw at it. But can you see how that devotion could be problematic? Joy countered. You've essentially built a cult of personality around yourself. People don't just like you, they worship you. And that kind of influence comes with responsibility. I take that responsibility seriously every single day. That's why I'm careful about what I say. That's why I try to set a positive example. That's why I work as hard as I do. Because I know people are watching. I know kids are looking up to me, and I refuse to let them down. But you're not perfect, are you, Dwayne? Let's talk about that. Let's talk about the feud with Vin Diesel. Let's talk about the ego clashes on set. Let's talk about all the stories that suggest the nice guy image might not be entirely accurate. The mention of Vin Diesel seemed to strike a nerve. Dwayne's expression darkened. You want to talk about that? Fine. Let me tell you what actually happened. I called out unprofessional behavior on a film set, behavior that was affecting the entire crew. And instead of addressing the issue privately, it became a public thing. But here's what nobody talks about. The crew members who thanked me for saying something. The people who had been dealing with that behavior for years and felt like they couldn't speak up. That's the part of the story that doesn't make headlines. So you're the hero of that story too. Joy's voice was dripping with sarcasm. That's convenient. I'm not the hero of any story, Joy. I'm just someone who refuses to pretend that bad behavior is acceptable just because it comes from powerful people. If that makes me difficult, then I'm difficult. I'd rather be difficult and honest than easy and complicit. He shook his head, memories flooding back. When I left wrestling to try acting, everyone said I was crazy. They said wrestlers couldn't act. They said I'd be a joke. The first few movies, they were right. The Scorpion King was not exactly an Oscar contender, but I kept working. I kept learning. I took every voice lesson, every acting class, every piece of criticism and used it to get better. His voice grew more intense. Do you know how many auditions I did where they told me I was too big? Too ethnic, too muscular, too much? I was too much of everything for an industry that wanted me to be less. But I refused to be less. I refused to shrink myself to fit their expectations. And eventually, the industry had to expand to fit me. He began pacing slightly, his energy too big to contain in the conversation. You know what I think this is really about? I think you can't stand the fact that some people are genuinely positive, genuinely motivated, genuinely trying to make the world better. Because if that's possible, then what's your excuse? If someone can come from nothing and build something meaningful through hard work and optimism, then what does your cynicism accomplish? Joy's face flushed. That's not what this is about at all. Isn't it? Because you've spent the last 20 minutes trying to convince me and everyone watching that authenticity is impossible, that success must be fake, that positivity must be performance. And I think that says a lot more about you than it does about me. He stopped pacing and stood directly in front of the panel. I want to say something to everyone watching this, not to Joy, to you, the people at home who might be going through something hard right now. The people who are sitting in their own apartments, wondering if it's worth it to keep going. His voice softened, but it carried even more power than when he'd been confrontational. It is worth it. I promise you it is. The darkness is lying to you. The voice that says you'll never be anything is wrong. I know because that voice talked to me for years, and I'm standing here today as proof that it doesn't have to win. You don't have to let it win. He turned back to Joy one final time. You asked if my positivity is genuine. Here's your answer. It's the most genuine thing about me, because I know what the alternative feels like. I know what it costs to give up on hope, and I will spend every day of the rest of my life trying to make sure other people don't have to pay that price. He straightened his jacket with quiet dignity. I'm done here. Not because you won, Joy, but because I refuse to let this conversation be the thing that someone remembers today. I refuse to let your cynicism be louder than my message. He looked at Whoopi. Thank you for having me. I'm sorry it ended this way, but some things are more important than being polite. And with that, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson walked off the set of The View, leaving behind a studio that felt like it had witnessed something unprecedented. The man who never stopped smiling had finally stopped. The man who always found the positive had finally found his limit, and the woman who had pushed him there was left sitting at the table, surrounded by uncomfortable silence and the weight of everything she had just triggered. The cameras kept rolling, capturing Joy's expression as she tried to formulate a response to an empty chair. For once, she had no words. The woman who always had a comeback sat in stunned silence. Whoopi was shaking her head slowly. Sarah looked like she wanted to disappear. The audience sat frozen, processing what they had just witnessed. What had started as an attempt to deconstruct an image had become something else entirely. A man defending not just his brand, but his survival. Not just his success, but his struggle. Not just his positivity, but his pain. In the days that followed, the interview would become a phenomenon. Not for the confrontation itself, but for what it revealed. That even the strongest people carry wounds. That positivity isn't the absence of pain, but the choice to keep going despite it. And that sometimes, the most powerful thing a person can do is stop smiling and show the world what's really underneath. Dwayne Johnson would eventually address the interview on social media, not with anger, but with characteristic grace. He would talk about the importance of protecting your peace, about knowing when to walk away, about the difference between critics and cynics. And millions of people who had ever felt broken, ever felt hopeless, ever felt like the darkness might win, would watch that clip and see something they needed to see. Someone who understood, someone who had been there, someone who proved that the other side of the tunnel was real. His daughter Simone, who had become a wrestler herself, would post a simple message that would be shared millions of times. This is my father, not The Rock, not the brand, my father, and I've never been more proud of him. That was the real Rock. Not the catchphrases or the movies or the muscles, but the man who had rebuilt himself from nothing and refused to let anyone tell him that rebuilding wasn't real. The man who had carried his family's legacy while creating his own. The man who had learned that strength wasn't about never breaking, but about how you put yourself back together when you do. What do you think about this incredible confrontation? Was Joy Behar out of line, or was she just doing her job? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And make sure to subscribe for more stories that will absolutely leave you speechless.